Thank you, Brian. I'd like to echo what all the other speakers have said about Brian, Anna, Giles and the team. This is an astonishing event. For me, it's the high point of my summer. So thanks to the Horton family and the team for everything that you've done. Just, great, good. I've got the hang of this. I was one of those precocious teenagers who started collecting when I was 13 years old. I focused initially on antiquarian books and etchings and engravings from the 16th century through to the early 19th. The very first book I ever bought was a recipe book written by a man called John Knott, who was the cook to the Duke of Bolton. So it was a very high status book, published in 1723. I immediately learnt a little bit about what collecting was about from that book, because on the blank flyleaf at the beginning, inscribed in handwriting, was Thomas Atkinson, his book, 1724, in handwriting. And below it, there was another inscription, Faith Dorney, her book, 1761, and then there was a later 18th century name with a date from the 1790s, and then a Victorian bookplate of a previous owner. And echoing something that Tim Schroeder said yesterday, I realized really that we're not really collectors, we're temporary custodians of these things. And there's a chain of people, before me who have owned this object as a book. Later on, I started collecting English delftware, glass, various tableware, but that was the thing that started me off, really. Curiously, the next book I bought was a bibliography, because I was very curious about this culinary collection, and I wanted to learn more. And I bought a little book written by a man called Arnold Whitaker Oxford. It was a bibliography of English cookery books from the 16th century. And I decided, as a 14-year-old, that like a stamp collector, I wanted to buy every single book that was in the bibliography. By the time I was 28, I had about 90% of the books. But curiously, when I was about 18, I bought a book at Sotheby's in an auction, a very important English cookery book. And I looked on the flyleaf, and there was Arnold Whitaker Oxford's name. This was a book that had belonged to him, this man who taught me a little bit about, collecting, which is really, really interesting. And I now own 6 of his books, which have recycled into that kind of furrow, where the plough comes along and these objects go back into the system and us collectors buy them. But I didn't know at the time, but these books were going to be the foundation of a midlife career, which has gone on for 35 years now, where I've ended up working in private and public collections in Britain, Europe, and the Americas as well. And how this started was, I live in a remote part of northern England, the Lake District. It's a long way from any major collections. The nearest wonderful institution to me is the Bowes Museum in Barnard Castle, which has got a pretty extraordinary collection of porcelain, silver, glass, all the kind of things that were on the theatre of the table, which I was beginning to get very interested in. And I was invited in the 90s by Howard Coots, who was the ceramics curator at the time, and his director, Elizabeth Conran, to be the curator of a little exhibition which was called The Tempting Table. They have period rooms, well, they used to have period rooms at the museum. They've all been taken down now. So we created 5 table settings from the early 17th century through to the 19th, using tableware in the collection there. That was the very first job I ever did in a museum. And it was the year, it was 1994. Do you remember that incredible exhibition at Versailles of the sort of pre-revolutionary silver? And Roy Strong came up to review my exhibition for Country Life magazine. And he very kindly said, well, you know, at the same time that this exhibition in a regional museum was happening, curated by Ivan Day, this grand slam exhibition of really important French silver. And he said, Ivan managed to not ignore the food on the table. So I really thought the food was really essential to how tableware, whether it was glass, whether it was porcelain, whether it was silver, cutlery, or even table textiles, how they were actually used as a theatre, really, for the diners. So what I'd like to do is to go through how I've interpreted objects in collections all over the place, and take you through my career, if you like, illustrating this. So this table that you're looking at the moment came about because I had discovered that there was some objects for sale in Lugano. An antiquarian book dealer called Francesco Radaelli wrote to me, and he said, I've got this extraordinary collection. First of all, there's a watercolour of pièce montée for setting up, you know, in the middle of the table, with about 50 watercolours, but also a big box of moulds to make them out of sugar paste. So I said, really? And I went to see it. I couldn't believe it. And I said, where'd you get this from? And he wouldn't tell me. He just wouldn't tell me. And it turned out, I figured out, because I went through them and I found some interesting coats of arms. One of them was for the Princess de Lamballe, who was from the House of Savoy, as was the son of the last king of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele. And he had finally admitted that he'd bought these from Vittorio Emanuele, who lived in Switzerland. And I didn't buy them personally, but I persuaded the Bose Museum, where I had an exhibition in 1994, to buy them. And we got money from the Arts Collection Fund and from the Lottery Fund. And we bought them, and they're now in the museum as part of their collection, thanks to me in a way, because I thought they were really important. And this was one of the settings that I made. This was in 2007, using these extraordinary moulds that were in this collection. And also, you'll see in a minute the watercolours that we also purchased. But let me just go a little bit further on, because what happened was, when I was a teenager, I got very interested more in confectionery than cookery. And I couldn't believe that these people made these extraordinary table figures, not out of porcelain like the ones that Claudia has just shown you, but out of sugar paste. And I wanted to learn how to make this. And there was no one at all who could teach me. So I bought old confectionery manuals in French, Italian, and English, and learnt from these 18th century masters with just enough information. But I was missing the tools. They had molds and all sorts of other equipment. So I started collecting that. And it wasn't difficult because no one else was interested. And I knew what I was looking for. So I amassed this extraordinary collection, enabling me to do things like this. This was based on an engraving in a book written by 1750s French confectioner called Menon. And he gives a full working drawing of how to make this palace of Circe, with the parterres made of chenille, filled with colour sands, and also the figures of the whole myth of Odysseus as men being turned to swine by this sorceress. That's another view of it. So this ended up in the Getty Research Institute for an exhibition that I worked on with Marcia Reed there. So this was like the ultimate kind of thing that I ever dealt with, really, in a museum. It was an exhibition called The Edible Monument, and it had two iterations. One was in 1999, the first one, and I did this again in 2015, quite recently. And it went on to Detroit. Alan Darr, took it on. So it moved from California across to Michigan, and I was setting something up it was a collection of prints. You can see some of these wonderful prints of various fêtes at Versailles. And I was setting something up, and suddenly this school party came into the gallery, and they thought this was all made of porcelain, and then their teacher said, oh no, it's made of sugar, and that's the man who did it. And I suddenly got mobbed by these children who were absolutely amazed by this. But how that started was this. I made a prototype of this in 1994 at this first exhibition that I did at the Bowes Museum. The Bowes Museum had some period rooms, and this was a very important one because this was the very first Rococo interior in England from Chesterfield House, which was the home of Philip Stanhope, the fourth Earl of Chesterfield, who amazingly employed a French chef de cuisine called Vincent de Chapelle, who became very, very noted. So this is the panelling in his room. I don't think it had been a dining room, but we set it up as a dining room. And I pulled out of the display cases a lovely full hand-sewn Chelsea botanical service with some wonderful Worcester baskets and some Derby figures, and set up for my first attempt at making a surtout dessert table, but with real confectionery on the table. I realized you can't really put fresh meat and fish in a museum setting, and I didn't want to do rubber ducks and rubber chickens, which always look absolutely awful. And I said, well, but you can do confectionery. So this is what we did, and it stayed fresh for 6 months. This is the thing that Roy Strong really loved. We investigated these 5 different table settings. We wanted to show people basically how service à la française, you know, where the soups and other gros entrées came onto the table. But we explored it in the middle, well, the first half of the 19th century in England. So we based a table, again, using stuff in the collection at the Bowes. We didn't have these sort of Spode transfer printed, but we managed to use this Mason's ironstone, very similar service, and set that up just to show how, you know, this French style of dining did actually survive well into the 19th century. Everyone thinks that, you know, service à la Russe replaced it, but it took a long time. So we looked at that too. So I was able to use, you know, porcelain in the collection. And then some years later, 10 years later, I found myself at the Bowes Museum again with a new director, Adrian Jenkins, and working again with Howard Coots. And I said, well, I've just discovered this extraordinary collection. Why don't we buy it? And they had the vision to buy it for the museum. I had it in my home for 6 months. And I used the molds and I used the watercolors to recreate a number of tables. This was one of them. What they had a Napoleon III Sèvres dinner service, you know, the one with the cipher on it. It's very, very common. But there were so many, and I needed to put things in plates. So it didn't really matter that it was quite later in the 19th century. I just needed plates. So we used that. We actually made the surtout, which this is on. It's a neoclassical one based on a French surtout. Let me take you through. So this is one of the watercolors. You'll notice there was a triumphal arch, just like the one just up the road here, basically opposite Apsley House. And this is just after the Napoleonic Wars. And among the molds in the box, there was one to make the quadriga of horses, but no chariot and no, you know, a driver. So I just put the horses on top. I thought, I'm not going to try and make the other bits because I hadn't got the... So for instance, here's another watercolor. This magnificent, these are early 19th century, they're probably from 1820s, and they're from the House of Savoy, so they're basically, you know, from northern Italy really, what is northern Italy now. And the paintings were made by a confectioner called Prati, an Italian confectioner. We don't know his name, but the molds to make that obelisk were in the box. All the swags at the bottom, all of the other features were there. So we were able to, you can see the 4 obelisks there. I had such a short gestation period to put this together that I called in a couple of colleagues to help. My close friend Peter Breers, who was a museum professional, he was the director of Leeds Museums and Art Galleries, and he and I worked together on this. And also a sculptor who works for me sometimes, a wonderful model maker called Tony Barton. And we made all this stuff in about 3 weeks. So some of these molds from this Savoy collection were from the 1820s, the majority of them. But there were some that were pre-revolution. And this was the most astonishing. This was in a little group. And you can see here, this strange carving is actually to make a sugar basket. You press it out the paste into it, and then you flex it. You could flex it round a Starbucks coffee, cup. But there was a wooden former to flex it round, and it fitted exactly. But what's carved underneath are the ciphers of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. And associated with this was another mold. The one you can see at the bottom right, which is the coat of arms of the Princesse de Lamballe. And I realized, I knocked that out and I stuck it onto see the little cartouche at the back with the little dauphin, the little dolphin. It makes a little easel. And I actually used the correct colors and the gilding for the Princesse de Lamballe's, and it fitted perfectly on the cartouche. And so did the ciphers of Louis and Marie Antoinette. And Lamballe actually entertained the Queen twice before she met her untimely death in the Terror. I don't know whether that really was how it was used, but it seemed to make a lot of sense to me. So there is her stemma, and for this exhibition that we put together, Lord Rothschild lent us that dessert plate, which was from the Marie Antoinette Sèvres dessert service. And you'll notice the sugar basket, you can see I filled it full of flowers. It was probably designed as a bonbonniere, But the echoes between porcelain and sugar was something that I really learned a lot about with this exercise. So I'll go through. There were 53 molds in this great trunk, and many of them made very small little novelty objects, which at the time were known as toys, sugar toys. And in the French-speaking world, and even here in London, these little things are made by confectioners, knocked out of these molds. They could mass produce them, and they were often on the table next to your assiette. And particularly the ladies could take these home with them, which was a tradition that actually started in 17th century Italy, where they had these extraordinary Baroque trionfi di tavolo, these sculptures made of sugar. And there was a great gathering in the Piazza Navone, in the Palazzo Pamphili in 1687, where pupils of Bernini made shoes. I'll show you some of them later. And the ladies took them home in their carriages. And that was a sort of, and I think these little toys relate to these little portable things. And they really echo objects in porcelain at the time. These are some of Prati's watercolors. What these are really, they're pre-Calder mobiles. They're table mobiles, which are also edible. If you think about the one on the left, you've got these parrots with lanterns, and they're on wires. So any movement on the table, and the whole thing is going to start to sway and agitate. So this is part of the theatre of the table, all entirely made out of sugar. We only had some of the molds, so I unfortunately couldn't make these because it was many of them had gone missing. Just to illustrate, this is one of the molds, which was to make this suit of armour and a helmet. You can see the mold on the left, and that's what it made. And again, there were molds to make these tazze with dolphins. There again is that Lamballe coat of arms. I thought it might be a little identification thing on a table to mark where the princess sat and thus the two ciphers of the king and queen. So this was, I thought, pretty major stuff. Now, I know we had a lecture a couple of years ago from a dear friend from Munich about pugs. Remember that? The poodles were actually hunting dogs. And this is one of the watercolors by Prati. And that is actually he carved these molds making one of the little poodles. But look at the wonderful little neoclassical stand with the mandolin or the lute on it. And that's a mirror with 4 little dolphins. So these are toys, you know, for ladies to take home. And these really, they're based on the Percier-Fontaine designs, really. I mean, it's that period. And look at this. Poodle pulling a chariot, you know. So, you know, this is a lost world, really. It relates to ceramics, it relates to food. So it was a real privilege to actually, you know, conceive this idea and to bring it to life. And if you look at the, can you see this lovely basket here? There is the mold that you make it from. So that makes the actual side of it. Look, can you see that? That makes the cover over the top. That makes the handle there. And the base is hidden under there somewhere. But there was another object, which was a little wooden former, which you could flex this thing around to make that. Okay. Now, when I made it, it basically was as fine as cobweb. It was much finer than any biscuit porcelain, and you could eat it, and it would dissolve in your mouth in seconds, like a sweetie. And here are some, can you see the lanterns, which were part of the mobile? It was such, and there's another little basket mold there, which you can see, which is a much simpler thing. It's just you can see this little push mold? That makes a little basket like that. There were lots of molds to make things like asparagus, pickled cucumbers, you know, all out of sugar. The same exhibition, we decided to explore this whole issue of how this kind of table sculpture. And this is, in fact, some wonderful engravings from a book that I bought when I was 19. It was John Michael Wright's book, an account of Roger Palmer's embassy to Innocent XI, which was held in the Palazzo Pamphili. John Michael Wright was a portrait painter in the 17th century, one of sort of Lely's competitors, but he was the only British member of the Guild of St. Luke and lived in Rome. And he got these sculptors who were pupils of Bernini to make these extraordinary trionfi. The two here you see, there's Vulcan, they're the elements, and Nettuno, of course, you know, and that was emblematic of James II, who had been the admiral of the fleet and had come to the throne. And some of you will know this because it's very, very famous. But between Tony Barton, who is I'm not Bernini, I can't make things up to this level, but Tony could. Between the two of us, we managed to actually make this sugar sculpture. Thrown a nice bit of Maiolica in the back for Tim there, you know, just to put it into context. So we wanted to bring to life this extraordinary tradition. Anyway, back in 2000, I worked with English Heritage, the York Civic Trust, and the Norfolk Museum Service, and we did a 3-venue exhibition looking at food between the time of Elizabeth I and Elizabeth II in England. And another book I'd collected as a teenager had this engraving in it of a garter feast that was held for the Duke of Newcastle in Windsor in 1698. And I said, let's do it, we'll replicate it. So we So that is the second course. All the tureens, well, they didn't have tureens then, but the soups and the stews have all been served, and you're left with the dessert in the middle of the table, and then all these meat and fish dishes. You have to realize that this was the king's table. Queen Mary had died 4 years before, and this was just for him. He sits there alone, attended by a noblemen who serve on him, and he chooses what he wants. So there's hardly any room for his little assiette where he sits down and he says what he wants, and his carver will go and cut him some goose or whatever. But this is how, you know, we wanted to sort of bring across this idea of opulence. And again, like the sugarwork, a lot of the pastry is incredibly sculptural. So for instance, that is a lobster pie in the form of a lobster. These are wild boar pies. There's a salmon pie. These were all based on sort of late 17th century engravings. And those kaleidoscopic little things are mince pies. Again, you know, made in these incredible forms from engravings, you know. So it's all really based on what really happened. Anyway, one of my fellow curators on that show was Peter Brown of the York Civic Trust at Fairfax House. And we started a working relationship that went on for about 11 years. And just about every year, Peter and I did a table in the Fairfax House dining room. This was for an exhibition we called Pyramids of Pleasure, where we actually looked at this trend. We got a lot of things wrong here. I mean, those of you who know about Chinese porcelain will know this is Nanking cargo ware. There was a whole load of it swilling around on the market at the time. And we bought it because they didn't have a full English porcelain service, so we threw that in instead. But I decided that we couldn't really recreate things. You know, what I call these is emulations, you know. We can create a nice atmosphere using original silver, glass, and porcelain and tableware and table linen, but we can't really do an exact recreation. That's impossible. So it's an emulation. That's my best word that I can use about these. And then I got summoned to Chatsworth. I'd done a little exhibition at Chatsworth for the Dowager a few years before. And then, you know, the Duke of Devonshire asked me if I would come and help do this. So this is one of the staterooms that was built with the improvements in the 1690s for a visit of William and Mary. They never came, and the Duke spent a fortune getting William Talman to come and remodel the house. And this was the room, you know, where the king would have eaten, the eating room. And so we used the first Duke of Devonshire's extraordinary collection of silver. Interestingly enough, the cistern underneath, we talked about somebody being baptized in the family are baptized in that still, not with champagne, but with baptismal holy water, I think, you know. But this again was based on that depot in the Met in New York, where there's this incredible floral arrangement around it. And then I worked with Selma Schwartz at Waddesdon for Lord Rothschild. And he had the Choiseul service for a short while, and we set it up. And I thought, well, let's do it and really recreate what a dessert table looked like. Of course, the chairs around there, they're 19th century, so they don't quite fit in. But if you're looking at the table, this was one of the high points in my career, actually, because this is this extraordinary Sèvres fruit basket. I think it's one of the most wonderful objects in the universe. And there were two of them. And I had the pleasure of filling them with the artificial fruits that were served at court at that time. The Choiseul service did not have any figures, so we used, I think, some from the Starenburg service to fill the table. So you're looking along the surtout there. There was no surtout, we had to make a fake one. So again, it's an emulation. You can see the little cocky shape there. And if you look, you can see some little stars in it. And this was a mid-18th century confection called meteors. And you made them out of pistachio marzipan, which that's why they're green. And you cut them into little stars with a trail behind, you know. This is sort of French court food, which was, you know, and there are cannelons, there are wafers, of course, gaufres. And this was my favorite photograph because one of these wonderful, I think Boucher designed these, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a little jamblette vendor on the street. So I had to put the cocky shape next to it. I put some jamblette in them, you know, and trying to echo the poetry of that just lovely little boy. And of course, this was a time when confectioners were very, very skillful at making artificial flowers, rather like the manufactories were making them of porcelain. So I copied the flowers on Sèvres porcelain. You know, those of you who are familiar with it will recognize some of these flowers. Some of them are real, some of them are, you know, are imaginary. But it brought to life, I thought, this service in a way which could only happen if you put it on a table with food, really. And these wonderful tasses à glace from the same service with a little plateau underneath, 3 flavors, barberry, épine vinette, and this pistache, and also rye bread ice cream, again, favorite court recipes. Then I got asked by Maureen Cassidy Geiger to help her with an exhibition at the Bard in New York. And she'd organized the loan of this extraordinary centerpiece. It's a Parnassus, designed and sculpted by Johann Joachim Candler, another great hero. And it was made as a gift, a diplomatic gift for the Empress Elizabeth of Russia in the 1740s by Augustus III. And we had a lot of problems with this one, but eventually we set it up. And here is, you know, my attempt at doing this extraordinary table with these baldacchini. There's only one because we put a sheet of mirror between the end of the table to actually, you know, make the table look much grander because we didn't have a lot of, the service is the St. Andrew's service. Those candlesticks are Russian St. Andrew's. But the baldacchini were based really on this Austrian event where Maria Theresa is at this Feast of the Oath of Allegiance. She's shortly going to be made the Empress. You can see she's sitting to the right of her husband, Franz Anti, which means she's more important than him. And you can see the imperial crown coming in to the table. And I put I made some baldacchini for Maureen's exhibition, but I didn't have anything to make the Solomonic twisted columns. And I bought, amazingly, some 18th century wooden molds that I could do that with. So I did this for another exhibition, which I worked on with Meredith Chilton, Geoffrey Munger, and Claudia was heavily involved. This was the wonderful Fired by Passion Dupaquier exhibition. When was it? Was it in 2009, was it? Yeah. And this was to recreate Marie Theresa's table. And this was an installation shot. It looks a bit sparse, but there's some wonderful Dupaquier on the table there. One of my favorite pieces was this panther, which I suspect was used for putting a bunch of grapes in. But we put, because it had a lot of purple in it, we put some artificial figs in. But I just enjoyed doing that. It was so much fun. And, you know, I think a revelation as well for visitors too. Then the same year I worked at Hillwood with Liana Paredes, a wonderful curator who sadly died far too young. And using Mrs. Hillwood, Mrs. Marjorie Merriweather Post's extraordinary fragments of the Du Rohan Sèvres service, we recreated this table with, you'll recognize some of the sculpture there. And again, these like eye-watering tasse à glace with ice creams in. I love getting into your toy cupboards, really. That's what it's all about, really. And then another one, this was a meal where we did have rubber ducks, but my model maker, Tony Barton, who's a genius, can you see a hare there with its ears on at the front? It's been larded, it has little strips of lard sewn in it so it doesn't dry out on a spit. So I got a real hare and we cleaned it, skinned it, stuck it on a spit, I larded it, I cooked it in front of a fire, and then we covered it with silicone rubber, and we made we made it from resin, and then between the two of us, we painted it, and it looked totally realistic. The same with those crayfish. I'll tell you another story about that. But this was really not so much porcelain. You'll see there's a Molander Meissen plates on there. But this is a recreation actually of an English table setting, which was based on an engraving, which I'll show you in a moment. But this was really to do with the fact that the Museum of Fine Art in Houston, this is in their little station, Rienzi, they've been buying a lot of silver, and my mate Christopher Hartop and I actually found a William Cripps pan for them and sold it to the museum. And they said, Ivan, will you come over and set it up? So the candlesticks are by Cripps as well. The little salts you see in the front are by Delamery, and the lovely sauce boats are Crespin. So it's wonderful Huguenot English silver. And I thought, let's again put food on the table. So we recreated more or less the second course, which is the one on the right, which has got, that's with there's a hair. So we recreated that using whatever they had at hand. And again, back in England, I was doing things like that with Peter Brown, again using Tony Barton, who could make a beef joint look like a real beef joint, rather than the dreadful rubber duck things, the fake food. So we did a lot of stuff together there. This was an early 19th century setting with another Cripps pan actually in the middle, again with silver. And then I did some work with English heritage. I set the 19th century dessert table up in Queen Victoria's dining room. And you'll notice the Minton tatse, the tiered tatse, which were not hers, but very similar to ones that she bought. She had a lot of Minton. But I covered it with 19th century confectionery, including an ice cream caddy in the form of a beehive, made out of meringue. Can you see that there? It's got, see the bees? They're made out of a pistachio nut, a currant, and 2 little flaked almonds for wings. But underneath it, it was intended to put an ice cream, and that kept it cold. It was the opposite of a tea caddy, And there's another one just there behind it from some Victorian chromolithographs. Amazingly, I was adjusting the tablecloth and I got under the table and there was a plaque and it said, when she died, Queen Victoria was laid out in her coffin on the dining table and the crowned heads of Europe came to offer their best wishes to her and say goodbye. And we found some fragments of black candle wax in the room, and apparently the whole of Osborne House was illuminated with black candles. And there were still little fragments in the table decker's room in the cupboards down there, which were from that. And then, so probably one of my favourite things that I ever did was this, which Kaywin Feldman, who's the director of the MII in Minneapolis, invited me to choose one of the period rooms there. And this was a room from a Suffolk manor house from the 1580s, which was bought by the museum quite early on, and they filled it full of quite ordinary English furniture. So I said, okay, what have you got in the collection? So there was this, and there was some very nice 17th century glass, Fashion de Venise, and some fairly important English salts and stuff like this. So what we did a little show called Supper with Shakespeare, trying to explore food culture during his time. And that's what we did in the end, you know, with a crazy kind of sugar building in the middle. Edible playing cards and all those sort of jocular things that Tudors had this rather childish sense of humour, loved to sort of play around with. And then you'll all know who this is. This was a highlight, actually. Some years ago, back in 2015, Meredith invited me to do something with this rather large Derby botanical service. It was sort of very late 18th or early 19th century. You can see some of the pieces there. There's a Soar glass without its lid in front. And there she is, darling Meredith. And we had the most fun I think we've ever had in our lives putting this together. And, you know, some of the pieces were by Quaker Peg, decorated by him. And the idea was to sort of hide his wonderful designs underneath my rather corny bits of confectionery. These are sugar seashells which had little messages and little novelties like bottles of perfume and diamond rings in them, you know, so that the female guests could... But we made 6,000 flowers to make these, and there is the final table, which is still in the gallery, actually. And it's just lovely to see how those things that are in the display cases there were actually used in a dining setting. And I'd like to conclude with a few ones from a more recent exhibition that I worked on. I know some of you here saw this at the Fitzwilliam just before lockdown. The exhibition opened in November 2019. It was meant to go on to September 2020, but we lost 3 months because it was shut down. And one of the settings was really this 17th century setting, which was based on this painting by Jan Bruegel the Elder and Rubens. Bruegel wasn't very good at figures, so he got Rubens to come in and paint the figures, but he could do pies and swans. And what I'd like you to do is, can you see how the pastry work here is gilded? Can you see these kind of little kind of Baroque whirligigs are all gilded? And the swan who's sitting on top, it's a swan pie, obviously. This tells you what's in it. The beak was gilded, the eye was gilded, and it's even wearing kind of Cartier-style jewellery, you know. And you might notice that there are little spots of gold leaf all over it. It's like gilding the lily, really. And all the other birds on the table, the peacock, the pheasant, and the partridge are all the same. So we really wanted to replicate this, and I pulled a lot of objects out of the Fitzwilliam collection and created this table. To sort of show how this extraordinary style of dining, with some Venetian glass on there, some wonderful cutlery, and some Augsburg and Nuremberg covered cups, a lot of other stuff that you can't see there. So that was the final thing. The food is all fake. While on the first day it opened, there was a man going around and he was trying to get over the rope that actually, and he said, can I touch that lobster? I said, no. He said, how did you get all the meat out of it and why doesn't it smell? I said, it's made of resin. He said, no, that's real. I'm a marine biologist. He said, I should know. So we'd reached a level of fakery, you know, which we were so pleased with that, you know. At that exhibition, we also recreated a London confectionery, the Pot and Pineapple from Berkeley Square, which was founded by Domenico Negri in the 1750s and managed by his wife eventually when he died, who was Anne Negri or Anne Gunter, and went on to become Gunters. Again, more sugar flowers, that's a sugar basket. But one of the points I wanted to do was explain that these confectionaries also were like china shops. They sold glass and they sold table porcelain, or they rented it out. And Negri did this. So I pulled these lovely bow candlesticks out and some lovely table glass, these sweetmeats. And we sort of put them in a display with a few pineapples thrown in for good measure, just to tell the visitors that this wasn't a place where you just bought sweeties for your table. And finally, this was another installation there, which ended up being my favourite one. This is a sugar banquet for a Jacobean wedding. Probably as Shakespeare was in middle age, this is the kind of thing that was being done in Britain. And it was inspired by some objects in the Fitzwilliam collection. There is a wonderful glass there. Some of you will know that by Giacomo Vezzolini. And it's dated 1578, and it's got two initials on it, AT and RT. It was for a wedding. It's engraved, it was almost certainly for a wedding. So what we decided to do was to try and focus on the food traditions of an early modern English wedding. So there were also a set of bride knives, early 17th century English bride knives. A bride was often given by her husband a set of knives, which she would eat with for the rest of her life. It was like an emblem of fidelity, rather like the wedding ring itself, so her husband's gift, which she would use every... So we put that in. We had a plume of rosemary in a cup, which was one of the things that they did at the wedding. And there were all sorts of other emblematic things. There are even some crack plates, because these were so popular at this period, but they're made of sugar and decorated, with the Chinese kind of designs. There's a pair of artificial sugar gloves. I don't think you can see them. But David Mitchell, who's a great chum of mine who collects early napery, lent us this spectacular 1590s Low Countries tablecloth, and also an Antwerp napkin from the same period. So what you can see in that, though, is the embryonic idea of making the table into a garden, as a knot garden, around the feature in the middle. And all of the tableware is edible. So once you've finished your sweetmeats, you can eat the tatse, the dolphin ones. I made those with some 16th century dolphin molds that I have. I started to acquire lots of equipment so that I could make this possible. You just can't do it unless you've got the kit. So I have a huge collection of these culinary objects that make this possible. So that's a little journey really through a rather unusual, it was really my third career. I've done lots of other things in my life. Just to sort of show how I like to interpret objects in museum collections and put them into a context which allows people to at least get a kind of atmospheric understanding of how they were originally used, whether it's glass, silver, porcelain, or table textiles. It's a great way of, and of course this engages particularly children and people who are not like us. They're interested in going to museums, but they get a bit bored going and looking at things in display cases. So that's it.